The lawyer slid the document across the table and said the words I never thought I would hear about my own son. Mr. Marsh, based on what you described, this isn't just aggressive branding. This may rise to the level of fraud. I sat there in a rented suit jacket in a glass office on the 9th floor, staring at a printout of my son's investor pitch deck, and on the third slide, under a photograph of my own store, it said, acquired a failing local business and rebuilt it from the ground up. Acquired. As if I had been a liability he purchased. As if 34 years of my life were a line item he absorbed. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not a man who goes looking for conflict. I raised my son to believe that family forgives, that blood matters more than pride, that you keep your mouth shut and your hands working and eventually people see the truth on their own. I believed that for 66 years. It took my son standing at a podium in front of 200 people, telling them my life's work started living the day he showed up, for me to understand that some silence isn't patience. It's just slow surrender. My name is Daniel Marsh, and this is the story of the year my son tried to erase me from a business I built with my bare hands, an 11-minute recording that stopped him from finishing the job. It started small, the way these things always do. A word change on a website. A joke at a supplier lunch that wasn't really a joke. A Saturday I stopped showing up to my own store because my son told me, gently, that my work jacket sent the wrong signal to clients. I want to walk you through it slowly because that's how it happened to me, not all at once, but one quiet erosion after another, until I looked up one day and realized the story of my own life had been rewritten by someone who called me Dad. Route 9 outside Fairview doesn't look like much if you drive it fast. Gas station. A diner that's changed hands for time since I was young. A stretch of Tulane Road that used to be mostly farmland before the subdivisions came in. In 1991, at the far end of that road, there was a 4,000-square-foot cinder block building with a hand-painted sign that read Marsh Hardware and Supply, because I couldn't afford a real one, and I could paint straight lines if I took my time. I was 31 years old. I had $11,000 from selling my father's truck after he passed, and a small business loan that took 3 attempts and one deeply uncomfortable dinner to secure. The loan officer's name was Carl Yeagle, and he spent most of that dinner asking questions about inventory turnover that I didn't know how to answer. My wife, Eleanor, did. She sat across from him with a pot roast she'd spent all afternoon on and answered every question like she'd been running supply businesses her whole life, even though she'd been a schoolteacher 2 years earlier. Carl approved the loan the following week. I've always believed it was a pot roast. Eleanor always said it was because she didn't let him see us sweat. For the first 2 years, I opened at 5:30 in the morning because contractors needed lumber and nails before their crews showed up at 7. I made every delivery myself in a truck with a heater that only worked if you kicked the dashboard in a very specific spot, something I discovered by accident during a February cold snap and treated afterward like sacred knowledge. Eleanor ran the register 3 days a week and did the books every night at our kitchen table, by hand, in a ledger with a green cover that I still have in a drawer home. She used to say, "We don't have money yet, so we'd better have manners." Every customer who walked through that door in the first 5 years got treated like they were doing us a favor, because they were. The business nearly died in year 4. A roofing supplier we depended on went under owing us product we'd already paid for, right before our busiest season. I didn't have the cash to restock. I remember standing in that store after closing, doing math on a legal pad that kept coming out wrong no matter how many times I ran it, and understanding, calmly and completely, that we were roughly 6 weeks from losing everything. That's when Gus Whitfield walked in. Gus ran a small trucking outfit and had been hauling deliveries for us on the side. He'd seen our books once by accident, an invoice left on the passenger seat of his truck, and he never forgot the number. He came by on a Tuesday evening, set $4,000 in cash on my counter, no paperwork, no interest, and said, "Pay me back when you can, and don't tell your wife I did this before I tell mine." I paid him back in 11 months. We shook hands on it instead of signing anything. That loan is the reason there was a business left to inherit 30 years later. I want you to remember that fact, because it matters more than you might think right now. Ryan came into the world 4 years after that, and into the business 30 years after that. And I want to be honest with you about how it started, because this is a story about a son who never did anything real. He'd spent 6 years in marketing for a regional supply chain company before I convinced him to come home. I was 61. My knees were finished from 3 decades on concrete. I wanted the name Marsh to keep meaning something on Route 9 after I couldn't climb a ladder anymore. The day he walked in wearing a quarter-zip sweater with a laptop bag over his shoulder, I felt something in my chest I hadn't felt in years. Pride, plain and simple. I thought, there he is. My son is going to carry this. For the first 8 months, he was extraordinary. I want that on the record before anything else, because what came later doesn't erase what came first. He built us a real website, something I'd never had the patience or the skill for. He negotiated a contract to supply account with 2 mid-sized builders that tripled our lumber volume in a single winter. He got us listed with the Regional Builders Association, something I tried and failed to do for a decade because I hated their paperwork. Employees liked him. Clients liked him. I liked him, and more than that, I was relieved because for the first time in 30 years I slept past 5 without guilt eating at me. The first thing I noticed was small enough that I laughed about it at the time. He asked me to stop coming in on Saturdays. Clients want to see a modern operation, Dad, he said, and you showing up in your work jacket with sawdust on it sends the wrong signal. I told him that jacket paid for his college textbooks. He laughed too, but he didn't change his mind, and I noticed weeks later that I was the one who'd stopped showing up on Saturdays. Not him reconsidering the request. Me, quietly complying with it. For months I typed our own website address into a browser one evening, the way I sometimes did just to admire what he'd built. The founder story had changed. It used to read, founded by Daniel Marsh in 1991, built on hard work and honest pricing. Now it read, Marsh Supply Company was reimagined by Ryan Marsh to serve the next generation of builders. Reimagined, not founded, not built, reimagined. Like the place of an tired motel, he'd flipped for profit. I called him about it that same night. He said, Dad, that's just branding language. Nobody reads about page that literally. I asked him to change it back. He said he would. He didn't. And I let 3 more weeks pass before I noticed he hadn't. And by then I'd already talked myself into believing it wasn't worth a second fight. At a supplier lunch that spring, I heard him tell a fastener company rep that he'd been running Marsh Supply, quote, since it was basically a shed on the highway. I was standing 3 feet away. The rep looked at me, visibly confused, because he clearly knew who I was, and Ryan just smiled and moved the conversation forward like he hadn't said anything strange at all. I didn't correct him in front of the rep. I told myself I'd handle it privately. I did handle it privately. He told me I was taking it too personally, that it's just how you tell a good story to a client. I started to wonder, quietly, whether the truth had simply stopped being useful to him. Pete Delgado had run our floor for 28 years. He knew every regular customer's name, their kids' names, usually what project they were working on before they said a word. He'd trained 4 store managers who went on to open their own places. In March, Ryan let him go. He called it a restructuring. He told me Pete's numbers on the new digital inventory system weren't where we needed them for where we were headed. Pete was 66 years old and had never touched a barcode scanner because for 28 years he never needed to. I found out after it happened, not before. I drove to Pete's house that night with a bottle of bourbon and no good explanation because I didn't have one. He opened the door already knowing why I'd come. Dan, I'm not mad at you, he said. I'm mad at the version of this place that doesn't need people like me anymore. I sat on his porch for 2 hours and didn't say much because there wasn't much defense I could offer. That was the night I stopped calling what Ryan was doing modernizing, even in my own head. I started calling it what it actually was, erasing. My daughter-in-law, Claire, almost told me the truth that same month, and it's the closest anyone in the family came to warning me before things got worse. We were alone in the kitchen on a Sunday, rinsing dishes while Ryan talked to an old friend of Eleanor's in the next room. Out of nowhere, Claire said, "He doesn't mean it the way it sounds, Dad. He just needs people to see him as more than the guy who inherited a hardware store." I asked her what exactly it sounds like when he says it. She went quiet, rinsed a plate far longer than the plate needed rinsing, and said, "It's complicated." She was 7 months pregnant. I didn't push. I regret that restraint more than almost anything else in this story. By early summer, Ryan asked me, gently, over coffee, whether I consider retiring outright, not stepping back. Retiring. He framed it as a gift. "Dad, you've earned rest. Let me carry this the rest of the way so you can actually enjoy your grandkids instead of standing in a warehouse at your age." I told him I wasn't ready. He said, "Of course, no pressure. Take your time." He brought up again 3 weeks later, and again after that, each time a little more casually, like repetition was supposed to make it feel like my own idea eventually. Then came the contradiction I couldn't argue my way around. A regional business magazine ran a feature on growing local supply companies, and Ryan gave the interview. In it, he said Marsh Supply had, quote, quietly struggled under old ownership for 2 decades before he took the reins and doubled revenue in 3 years. I still had the actual tax filings in a drawer at home. We hadn't quietly struggled. We had grown steadily every single year except one. The year the roofing supplier collapsed, the year Gus Whitfield walked in with cash. Ryan's doubled revenue in 3 years was real, and I was genuinely proud of that number. But he'd built it on top of a foundation he was now calling a failure, which meant every dollar he was proud of required erasing 30 years he wasn't. I brought the magazine to his office and laid it open on his desk. He read the line back to himself and said, "That's not exactly what I said. Dad, journalists trim things for space." I asked him what he had actually said. He paused half a second too long. "Something close to that, but with more context," he said. I asked for the context. He didn't have it ready. That was the first time I watched my son struggle to defend his own sentence, and something in me went quiet and cold in a way it hadn't before. Gus called me 2 days after that magazine came out. He'd read it on a laptop his granddaughter had set up for him, which tells you how far the story had already traveled. He didn't yell. Gus never yells. "Dan, I've kept my mouth shut for 30 years because it wasn't my business to run, but I loaned that boy's father $4,000 with a handshake when this whole operation was 6 months from a bank auction, and I will not sit quiet while he tells strangers it struggled under old ownership." I asked him what he wanted to do. "Nothing yet," he said, "but I've still got that tape, Dan. And someday soon, somebody's going to need to hear it." The tape. I hadn't thought about it in years. Back in 1994, right after we survived the roofing collapse, a local AM station did a small community spotlight on businesses that had made it through a rough winter. Gus and I sat together in a cramped studio with a host named Doris Kellerman and talked for 11 minutes about nearly losing the store, about Gus's loan, about Eleanor keeping the books by hand at our kitchen table until we could afford a computer. When the station shut down years later, Gus's cousin, who'd worked there, pulled a copy from the archive before it got thrown in a dumpster. It sat in a shoebox in Gus's closet for over a decade until his granddaughter digitized it as a favor, never thinking anyone would need it played out loud again. I told him I didn't want to use it. I meant it at the time. "He's still my son, Gus," I said, "and if we play that in front of people, it humiliates him in a way he might not recover from professionally." Gus said, with respect, "Dan, you're worried about humiliating the man who's currently telling everyone the business struggled for 2 decades under your ownership. Somebody's getting humiliated here either way. The only question is whether it's the man who built it or the man who's lying about it." I didn't have a good answer for that. I told him I needed time. Time ran out faster than I expected, because erasure stopped being about words and started being about paper. In August, Ryan asked me to sign a document restructuring our ownership percentages, framed as a tax efficiency move his accountant recommended. I still held 51% of Marsh Supply Company on paper, a fact Ryan had apparently forgotten I knew cold, because I'd written that operating agreement myself with a lawyer in 1997, back when he was in middle school. The new document would have dropped me to 20% and made a majority owner outright. Standard for succession planning. He told me. I told him I'd have my own lawyer review it before signing anything. His face did something I hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly. More like the face of a man who'd been counting on a door being unlocked and just found out it wasn't. That's when I sat down with the lawyer, the one who slid that pitch deck printout across the table and used the word fraud out loud for the first time. Her name was Denise Okafor, a business attorney a friend of Gus's had recommended, sharp-eyed and unhurried in a way that made me trust her within the first 10 minutes. I brought her the magazine article, the website language, and because Claire had finally handed me a printed copy in a plain envelope with tears in her eyes, the investor pitch deck itself. Denise read through it methodically, flagging pages with small yellow tabs, not saying much until she'd finished. Then she looked up and said the sentence that reorganized everything in my head. Mr. Marsh, I need to ask you something directly. Does your son know you still legally control 51% of this company? I told her yes, he knew. He'd asked me to sign away in August, and I'd refused. She nodded slowly, like a piece had clicked into place for her too. Then he's raising investor capital, potentially closing a deal on a company he does not have controlling ownership of, based on a history that is, by your own documentation, false. That's not just ethically troubling. Depending on how far the deal has progressed, that could constitute securities fraud, or at minimum, expose him and this business to serious civil liability. I sat there in that glass office with my hands flat on the table and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not vindication. Fear. Real fear for my son, the kind I hadn't felt since he was 11 years old, and broke his arm falling off the shed roof, trying to prove something to the neighbor kids. I asked Denise what happens next if this goes forward. She said it plainly, the way good lawyers do. If the deal closes and the investors later discover the history is fabricated, they could sue for rescission and damages. If it's found the fabrication was material to their decision, and it clearly was, given it's the centerpiece of Slide 3, this stops being a family disagreement about branding language. This becomes something with his name and yours attached to a courtroom. I asked her the only question that mattered to me in that moment. Can we stop it before it gets that far? She said yes. If we move now, carefully, and if I was willing to use the leverage I actually had, 51%. A truth only I could verify. And she added, glancing at the folder Claire had given me, apparently a witness or two who already know parts of this don't add up. I left that office with a plan for the first time since this whole thing started, and it wasn't a plan built on hurt feelings anymore. It was built on protecting my son from a mistake big enough to end his career before it truly began, whether he understood that yet or not. I called Claire that night, careful with my words, because I promised her I wouldn't repeat where I'd heard things. I asked only one question. Is the investor deal still open, or has anything been signed? She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her checking that no one else was in the room with her. Not signed, she said. There's a call scheduled for next week. Final terms. I think once that call happens, it's real, Dad. I think once that call happens, there's no taking it back. I thanked her and told her, again, that she'd done nothing wrong by telling me. She said something I've thought about since. I keep telling myself I'm protecting our daughter by staying quiet. But I think I'm just protecting myself from an argument I'm scared to have. I told her that was probably the most honest sentence anyone in this family had said out loud in a year, including me. Gus and I met the next evening at the same diner, where we used to sit as younger men, working out how to save a business that was 6 weeks from failing. This time we were working out how to save it from succeeding on a lie. He asked me directly if I was finally ready to use the tape, not as a public spectacle, but as leverage quietly before the investor call. I told him I wasn't sure recording alone would be enough anymore, not against a pitch deck and a signed agreement waiting to happen. I told him I thought we needed something harder to argue within an old radio interview. I told him I thought we needed the truth, laid out on paper, in front of witnesses, before Ryan picked up that phone. That was the night the plan changed from confronting my son at a podium to stopping him before he made a mistake he couldn't undo. I didn't want him humiliated in front of 200 strangers anymore. I wanted him stopped, quietly, completely, and honestly, before the version of himself he was building collapsed in front of people whose money he needed. I spent the following 4 days gathering what I actually had. The original 1997 operating agreement from the safe deposit box, still showing my 51% in black and white. Old invoices from 1993 with my handwriting on them, including one for roofing material with Gus's name penciled into margin where he'd co-signed for the replacement order. A photograph from 1998, taken by a newspaper stringer of Eleanor and me in front of the store the day we paid off our first mortgage on the property. A photograph that had somehow, sometime that spring, been quietly moved from the front office to a storage closet to make room for a framed magazine cover of Ryan. And, finally, the flash drive Gus had kept for over a decade in a shoebox, containing 11 minutes of a version of the story nobody could argue with, because it was our own voices, recorded in 1994, saying exactly what happened and exactly who helped. Denise reviewed all of it and said something that steadied me more than I expected. "Mr. Marsh, this isn't a case of you against your son. This is a father with documented majority legal ownership, discovering that a family member has been operating outside the bounds of that ownership, using a fabricated history, in a deal that could expose everyone to real liability. You are not the villain in this story, whatever it feels like. You're the person who can still stop the worst outcome from happening." I asked her to draft a letter, formal but not cruel, laying out the actual ownership structure, the factual inconsistencies in the pitch materials, and a requirement that any investor communication going forward include accurate information or be paused entirely until it did. I told her I wanted it delivered to Ryan 2 days before that scheduled call, not as an ambush, but as a warning with enough time for him to make the right choice himself. I want to tell you honestly that some part of me hoped he'd read that letter, understand immediately what he'd done, and call me in tears before I ever had to say another word. That's not what happened. What happened was worse. And then, eventually, better than I could have imagined, Ryan called me the evening the letter arrived, and his voice on the phone was not the voice of a man who understood. It was the voice of a man who felt cornered. "Dad, what is this?" he said. "Legal letterhead. Threats about the pitch deck. You're going to blow up a deal that's going to set this family up for the next 20 years over branding language." I told him it wasn't branding language anymore. "Ryan, it's a legal document being shown to people with real money, describing a company history that isn't true, filed under a claim of majority ownership that isn't yours." He went quiet for a moment, and then he said something that told me exactly how deep this had gone. "Dad, if this deal falls apart because of you, I don't know how I come back from that professionally. Do you understand what you're doing to me right now?" I told him, as calmly as I could manage with my hands shaking slightly against the phone, that I wasn't doing anything to him. I was refusing to let him do something to himself that he couldn't undo. I told him the call needed to be postponed, that Denise would be present for any future conversation about ownership or investor materials, and that the choice in front of him was simple. Even if it didn't feel simple, correct the record now, quietly with dignity, or let it collapse publicly later with neither. He hung up on me. Actually hung up for the first time since he was a defiant teenager who did it over curfew arguments 20 years earlier. I sat in my kitchen that night, at the same table where Eleanor used to do the books by hand, and I let myself feel the full weight of what was happening, not as a business dispute, but as a father watching his son build a version of success balanced entirely on a lie, and not knowing in that moment whether the son I raised was still somewhere underneath the version standing in front of investors. Claire called me 2 hours later, and she was crying a way I'd only heard once before, the night their daughter was born. "He's furious, Dad," she said. "He thinks you're trying to destroy his career out of jealousy." I asked her gently what she thought. She was quiet for a long moment. "I think," she said, "he's more scared than he's letting either of us see. I think somewhere in there he knows you're right, and that might be worse for him than if you were wrong. The investor call didn't happen that week. Denise's letter accomplished that much on its own, buying us time we desperately needed. But Ryan didn't come to me either. Not for 6 full days, days I spent mostly in the store, restocking shelves I need to restock, talking to customers I'd known for decades, feeling the particular loneliness of having done the right thing, and having no idea yet whether it would cost me my son. On the 7th day, he came to the house, not the store, the house, which told me something before he said a single word, because Ryan avoided the house lately the way you avoid a place that holds too many memories of who you used to be. He sat down at the kitchen table, in Eleanor's old chair, which none of us ever sat in anymore without thinking about it, and for a long time he didn't say anything at all. I want to tell you honestly, this was not the confrontation I had imagined in my angrier moments. There was no triumphant reveal, no dramatic speech, no moment where I laid every piece of evidence on the table like a lawyer in a movie. It was quieter than that and slower, and it hurt in a completely different way than I expected. He finally spoke. "Dad, I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually listen, not just wait for your turn to respond." I told him I was listening. He said, "When I came into this business, everyone still saw me as your kid, not as someone who could run something. Every builder, every supplier, every bank we talked to, they'd ask about you first, like I was just filling a chair until you decided to sit back down in it. I told myself if I could make people believe I built something real, on my own, eventually it would become true enough that it wouldn't matter how it started. I told myself the story was just a tool to get people to take me seriously long enough to actually earn it. I asked him the question I'd been carrying for months. Ryan, when you told that magazine this place quietly struggled for 2 decades, did you believe it was true, or did you know it wasn't and decide it sounded better?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd heard it in years. I think somewhere along the way I stopped being able to tell the difference between the story that helped me and the one that was actually true. That was the first completely honest sentence he'd said to me in over a year, and it hurt more than the anger had, because it meant he hadn't set out to be cruel. He'd let ambition quietly replace memory, one convenient exaggeration at a time, until the exaggerations were the only version he had left to stand on. I told him what I needed, not as punishment, but as terms Denise and I had discussed carefully over the previous days. The operating agreement stayed exactly as written, 51% mine, and if you want majority ownership someday, it will be negotiated properly on paper with lawyers, never slip past me again as a formality. The website founder story got corrected that week. Both our names honestly described. Pete Delgado needed a real phone call, not a rehire necessarily, though I hope for that too, but at minimum an honest acknowledgement that letting him go had been about cost, not competence. The investor pitch could keep every real number in it. The tripled lumber volume, the doubled revenue, all true and all genuinely his, but it needed to say built upon instead of revitalized entirely under, because upon was true and entirely under was a lie, and I was done letting family loyalty pass for permission to be lied about. He didn't argue with any of it. That surprised me more than anything else that night. He sat there in his mother's chair and nodded slowly at each condition like a man finally putting down something heavy he'd been carrying too long to notice how much it weighed. The website correction happened within the week. I'll give him that. He didn't drag it out or fight me on the wording once we'd agreed on it together. He called Pete Delgado himself. Not through HR, not through an email his assistant drafted. The call was short, a little stiff, but real, according to Pete, who told me about it over coffee a few days later. Pete didn't come back to the floor. He was 66 and had already started fixing up boats for friends as a retirement hobby, quietly turning into a small side income. But he told Ryan on that call that he appreciated being called instead of forgotten, which is a lower bar than any of us should be proud of clearing. But Ryan cleared it, and I noticed, and I told him I noticed. The investor deal itself didn't survive the correction, and I want to be honest that this part hurt Ryan more than almost anything else in this entire year. Once the pitch materials were revised to reflect the truth, built upon a 30-year foundation rather than revitalized entirely under his leadership since a fabricated decline. 2 of the 3 investors quietly withdrew interest within a month. The story had stopped being tidy, and money, I've learned, likes tidy stories more than it likes true ones. Ryan took that loss hard, harder than our kitchen table conversation in some ways, because it wasn't emotional. It was financial, and it was entirely traceable to decisions he alone had made. I found him in the store office one evening about 3 weeks after the correction, staring at a spreadsheet that wasn't going to change no matter how long he stared at it, and I sat down across from him without saying anything for a while. Finally, he said, without looking up, "I built something real, Dad." Why wasn't that enough on its own? I told him the truth, as gently as I knew how to say it. It was enough, Ryan. It was always enough. You just couldn't see that, because you were too busy comparing it to a version of me that never actually stopped you from having your own story. You made me the villain in your story so you could be the hero of it, and the tragedy is you never needed a villain at all. He didn't respond to that for a long time. When he finally did, it wasn't a big speech. It was smaller than that and more honest for it. "I don't know how to be proud of something that has your name on it, too," he said. I told him that not knowing how yet didn't mean it was impossible. It just meant he had work to do that had nothing to do with spreadsheets or investor decks. Roy Fenner, a long-time client who'd repeated Ryan's version of events to my face without knowing it was false, came by the store himself about a month later. He found me stocking fasteners, because old habits don't retire even when your knees ask you to. "Dan, I'm sorry I ever repeated that nonsense about you stepping away," he said. I told him not to apologize to me, that he'd only repeated what he'd been told plainly and had no reason to doubt. He said something that stuck with me since. "That's the part that gets me. I've known you 30 years, and I still believe the new version faster than I questioned it, just because it was said with more confidence. I think about that a lot now, how confidence gets mistaken for truth if nobody in the room remembers otherwise. Gus and I had lunch that same week. The 2 of us at the same diner, older now, slower, but still occupying the same booth out of habit more than preference. He asked if I regretted how it had all unfolded, whether I wished I had played the tape at that anniversary dinner after all, in front of everyone, the way I'd once imagined doing. I told him no. I told him I was glad it had ended in a kitchen and a lawyer's office instead of a banquet hall, because my son got me wrong in private and correct himself in private, and that mattered more to me than being right in public ever could have. Gus nodded slowly and said, "Dan, you didn't fail by staying quiet too long at the start. You failed a little by mistaking your son's confidence for permission, but you didn't fail at the end. At the end, you did exactly what a father's supposed to do. You stopped him before the fall got too far to survive. Claire and I talk more now than we did before any of this happened, which is one of the few unambiguously good things to come out of the entire year. She told me, a few weeks after everything settled, that she started keeping her own quiet record of things Ryan said that didn't match what she knew to be true, not to expose him, but because she didn't want her daughter growing up believing whichever version of the family story got told with the most confidence in a given year. I told her that was probably the healthiest thing anyone had done in this whole story, including me, and probably including her husband. Ryan and I still work together, though differently now, and I want to be honest that it isn't perfectly healed, because nothing that real ever is. He runs the day-to-day operations, and he's genuinely good at it, in ways I could never have been in the last decade of my working life. But he checks with me now before any interview, any pitch, any public description of this company's history, not because a lawyer requires it anymore, though for a while one did, but because he asked to on his own about 2 months after that conversation at the kitchen table. "Dad, I don't want to need a threat of legal trouble to keep me honest next time," he told me. I told him that was the first time in over a year he'd said something that sounded like his own voice instead of a pitch. I still go into the store most mornings, though not at 5:30 anymore, because 66-year-old knees have opinions my 31-year-old knees never bothered consulting. I stand near the counter sometimes and watch new customers walk in. People who never knew this place when it was a cinder block building with a hand-painted sign, and I don't correct anyone who assumes it's always looked this way. Some stories don't need defending in every room. They just need to be true when it matters. To the people who were actually there, and to the ones who will ask about it someday when we're gone. Eleanor used to say a business is just a family's promise written down in a way strangers can also believe in. I think about that whenever I walk past a spot in the office where a photograph hangs again, back where it belongs, beside a framed copy of the original 1997 operating agreement and a small, unremarkable flash drive that Gus gave me the week after everything settled, in case I ever need to hear 11 minutes of 1994 again. I haven't needed to. But I keep it close anyway, because the difference between inheriting a name and honoring one was never going to be decided at a podium under string lights, or in a glass office with a lawyer, or even at a kitchen table where a hard truth finally got spoken out loud. It gets decided in the quiet years afterward, in whether the story people tell about you matches the one you tell about yourself, with nobody clapping and nobody watching, just you and your son and the truth, slowly learning to agree with each other again. I haven't told you about the night before the letter went out, and I think you should hear it, because it's the part that still cost me something to say out loud. Denise had the letter ready 2 days early. I could have sent it immediately. I sat on it for one more night instead, and I drove out the store after closing alone and let myself into the dark building with my own key, the same key I carried on the same ring since 1991, worn smooth from 3 decades in my pocket. I walked the aisles in the dark without turning on the lights, because I didn't need to see to know where everything was. I could have found the 16 penny nails blindfolded. I stood in the spot where the old register used to sit before Ryan replaced it with a touch-screen system, and I thought about Eleanor standing right there, telling a nervous first-time customer that we didn't have money yet, so we'd better have manners. I thought about Pete Delgado's laugh, which used to carry from one end of the store to the other. I thought about my own son, 4 years old, asleep on a stack of moving blankets in the back office, because we couldn't afford a sitter, and Eleanor had a parent-teacher conference she couldn't miss. I want you to understand that I wasn't standing in that dark store gathering ammunition. I was saying goodbye to something, even though I didn't fully understand yet what I was saying goodbye to. Maybe it was a version of Ryan I'd built in my head, the one who was still that 4-year-old asleep on moving blankets, trusted me completely because he had no other choice yet. That version of him didn't exist anymore, and some part of me needed one quiet, private hour in the dark to accept that before I did anything that couldn't be undone. I sent the letter the next morning. I want to walk you through exactly what was in it, because Denise was precise about every word, and precision mattered more in that document than in almost anything I've ever put my name to. It stated the current ownership structure as recorded in the 1997 operating agreement. It stated that certain public and investor-facing materials described a company history inconsistent with documented financial records, which we attached, unredacted, 12 years of tax filings that told a very different story than quietly struggled for 2 decades. It requested formally that any pending or future investor communications be paused until the materials were corrected, and it noted carefully, without threat, that failure to do so could expose both the company and its officers to liability neither Ryan nor I could afford, financially or personally. Denise had wanted to include a line about the tape. I told her no. I told her the recording wasn't a threat. It was a truth I hoped we'd never need to use as a weapon, only as a fact if it ever came to that. She respected that, though I could tell she thought I was being softer than the situation required. Looking back, I think she was probably right, and I think I needed to learn that the hard way before the story was finished. The 6 days of silence after Ryan hung up on me were harder than anything else in this whole account, harder even than the confrontation itself, because silence gives you too much room to imagine the worst version of everything. I imagine him lawyering up against me. I imagine him closing the deal anyway, quietly, somewhere I couldn't see, betting that I wouldn't actually follow through. I imagine, in my darkest hour on the 4th night, that I had lost my son permanently over a business that suddenly felt like it wasn't worth what it was costing me. What I didn't imagine And what actually happened was smaller and more human than any of that. Ryan spent those 6 days. I learned much later, said it was his own accountant. Going back through the actual numbers, the real ones, the ones that didn't need a fabricated decline to sound impressive. His accountant, a careful young man named Fard Haydari, who Ryan had hired the year before, apparently told him something blunt on day 4. Ryan, your real numbers are good enough to raise capital honestly. You didn't need the story. You just believed you did. I didn't know that conversation happened until Claire told me about it weeks later, almost in passing, like she was still deciding whether it mattered. I think it mattered more than almost anything else in this story, because it meant somebody besides me had looked my son in the eye during those 6 days and told him the truth wasn't the obstacle. The lie was, when Ryan finally came to the house on the 7th day, I told you already what was said at the table. Why I didn't tell you was what happened after, later that same night, because the story doesn't end at the kitchen table, even though it would have been a cleaner place to stop it. Around 11 that night, after Ryan had left, my phone rang and it was Gus. He'd heard, somehow, faster than I expected, that Ryan had come to the house. Small towns move information faster than any of us like to admit. Gus asked me one question. Did he apologize, Dan, or did he just agree to terms? I sat with that question for a long moment before I answered honestly. Terms, I said. Not yet an apology. Gus was quiet on the other end of the line, and then he said something I've carried since. Terms are a start, Dan. But don't confuse a man agreeing to stop something with a man understanding why it was wrong in the first place. Watch for the difference. It matters more than you think it does right now. I want to tell you that Ryan's apology came quickly after that, wrapped up neatly within days. The way these stories sometimes get told, it didn't. It came in pieces, awkward and incomplete, over the following 2 months, and I think that's more honest than any single dramatic moment could have been. The first piece came about 10 days after our kitchen table conversation, when Ryan asked me, almost sheepishly, to come back to the store on a Saturday. Not to work, he said, just to be there. I want people to see you there again, Dad, not as a photo op, just because you should be there. I went. I wore the work jacket, the one with sawdust worked permanently into the seams, the one he'd once told me sent the wrong signal. He saw it when I walked in, and something in his face shifted, and he didn't say anything about it, which I understood, even then, as its own kind of apology. The second piece came when he asked me, over dinner about 3 weeks later, whether I'd be willing to record something for the corrected website, in my own voice, telling the actual founding story. Not a polished marketing video. Just me, on my phone, talking the way I'm talking to you right now. I did it in one take, standing near the spot where the old register used to be, and when Ryan watched it back, he had to leave the room for a few minutes before he came back and said, quietly, that's the story I should have been proud enough to tell from the beginning. The third piece, and the hardest one, came almost 2 months after the kitchen table conversation, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when nothing in particular was happening. Ryan found me in the back office, going through old invoices out of habit more than necessity, and he sat down across from me and said, without any lead-up at all, Dad, I need to actually say this properly, because terms of video and showing up on Saturdays isn't the same as saying it. I'm sorry, not for wanting to build something of my own. I'm sorry for deciding the only way to do that was to make people believe you'd failed. You didn't fail. I was scared of never being seen as anything but your son, and instead of dealing with that fear like an adult, I tried to erase the parts of you that made the fear feel true. That wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't honest, and I understand now that it wasn't even necessary. I could have built something real standing next to you instead of on top of you erased. I didn't say much back to him in that moment, because there wasn't much that needed saying. I just nodded, and after a while I said, thank you for finally meaning it instead of just managing it. He asked me what the difference was, and I told him managing an apology is choosing words that make the conflict stop. Meaning one is understanding why the words needed to be said at all. You just did the second one. That's rarer than you think, son, and it's worth more than you know. I want to tell you what happened to the Legacy Business Award, because I think it matters to the ending of this story, even though it felt like a small thing at the time. Once the corrected materials went out, Ryan himself called Patricia Ruiz, the committee representative, and withdrew our name from consideration entirely before she had to make the decision for us. He told her plainly that the original nomination had contained material inaccuracies about company history that he was personally responsible for, and that he didn't believe the business should be considered for an award built around a founding story until that story had been told honestly, publicly, and for longer than a single corrected website page. Patricia told me later, when I ran into her at a builders conference the following spring, that in 15 years running that committee, she never once had a business owner withdraw a nomination by taking personal responsibility instead of quietly blaming a marketing team or a journalist edit. She said it stuck with her. I told her it stuck with me too, for different reasons than she probably imagined. There's one more piece of this I haven't told you, and I've saved it for last on purpose, because it's the piece that finally let me exhale. About 4 months after everything settled, on a Saturday morning when the store was quiet and slow, Ryan asked me to come stand with him near the front counter, and he handed me something small wrapped in brown paper, the kind we usually use for wrapping fragile hardware before the company switched to plastic. Inside was a small brass plate, the kind you'd screw onto a wall or a desk, engraved simply, found in 1991, Daniel Marsh. Continued 2019, Ryan Marsh. Built together, not separately. I asked him where he wanted to put it. He said he already knew. He walked me to the spot in the front office where Eleanor's photograph hung, the one that had spent that strange spring quietly relocated to a storage closet, and he mounted a small brass plate just beneath the frame, level and centered, taking his time with it the way I used to take my time painting straight lines on a hand-lettered sign 34 years earlier. He stepped back, looked at it for a long moment, and said, I want every person who walks into this office in the next 30 years to know exactly whose shoulders this place is standing on. Not because the lawyer made me correct a website. Because I finally understand it myself. I didn't say anything for a while. I just stood there next to my son, in the office where his mother's photograph hung, looking at a small brass plate that had taken us an entire painful year to earn the right to hang honestly. Eventually, I said the only thing that felt true enough to say. Thank you for finally seeing it, Ryan. Not the way I wanted you to see it. The way it actually was. He nodded, and for the first time in over a year, the silence between us didn't feel like something either of us needed to manage. It just felt like two men standing in a store they'd built, together, finally telling the same true story about how they got there. I still think about Gus's question sometimes. The one he asked me on the phone the night Ryan first came to the house. Did he apologize, or did he just agree to terms? I know the answer now, because I watched it unfold slowly enough to actually see the difference. Terms were where it started. Understanding was where it finally landed, months later, quietly, without an audience, the way the truest corrections in a family usually do. The tape is still in a drawer in my office, next to the operating agreement, and Eleanor's photograph. I've never had to play it for anyone since that night in the diner, when Gus first offered to. I don't think I ever will now. Some evidence you keep not because you expect to need it, but because it reminds you what the truth sounded like before anyone had a reason to bend it. 11 minutes of two men, 30 years younger, telling the plain, unimpressive, entirely true story of almost losing everything and being saved by a handshake instead of a contract. I think about what Eleanor used to say, that a business is just a family's promise written down in a way strangers can also believe in. I understand that sentence differently now than I did the year this all happened. It isn't enough of the promise to be written down once correctly at the beginning. Somebody has to keep choosing to honor it year after year, especially in the years when honoring it is inconvenient or unflattering or slower than the story you'd rather tell instead. My son learned it the hard way, and so, if I'm honest, did I, because I let 30 years of quiet compliance convince me that staying silent was the same thing as keeping the peace. It wasn't. It was just delaying the day the truth would finally have to be spoken out loud by somebody who was tired of managing it. These days, I still walk the store most mornings, slower now, with knees that argue with every ladder I no longer climb. The small brass plate is still there beneath Eleanor's photograph, a little dulled now from 4 years of hands brushing past it. Customers pausing to read it. Ryan's own daughter, old enough now to ask questions, tracing the engraved letters with one small finger, and asking her father who Daniel Marsh was. I've heard him answer that question more than once, and he never shortens it anymore, never trims it down to something more flattering or more convenient. He tells her the whole thing. The cinder block building, the $11,000, her great-grandfather's truck, the handshake with a man named Gus that saved everything before either of them was born. I listen from the next aisle sometimes, pretending to restock something I don't need to restock, and I let myself feel something I spent an entire painful year afraid I might never feel again where my son was concerned. Not pride in what he built, pride in the fact that he finally learned to tell the truth about how he built it, standing on the shoulders of the people who came before him instead of standing on top of the space where their story used to be.